All right, hello. This is Matt Taibbi from Racket, and this is my first live stream for Racket. So forgive me if there are some bumps in this, but I've got a couple of ideas about things I want to do with this format going forward. It won't necessarily involve things like the Twitter files, but we're going to try it out with the Twitter files here tonight. One of the reasons I wanted to do this is because this story is particularly convoluted and difficult, but the convoluted and difficult parts are actually the interesting parts, and some of it may not have come through exactly clearly when I wrote it. So I just wanted to quickly summarize what's in this story, why it's important, and particularly why it puts the lie to so many news stories that have been put out in the last year or so by the subjects of this reporting. So overall, just in general, the reason that this is all coming out this week is because Jim Jordan's House Weaponization of Government Subcommittee put out a report. And as you can see, it's called The Weaponization of Disinformation, Pseudo-Experts and Bureaucrats, How the Federal Government Partnered with Universities to Censor Americans' Political Speech. And this is all, this is the result of an almost year-long effort to try to obtain a bunch of documents from Stanford's Election Integrity Partnership, about which Michael Schellenberger and I testified before that very committee back in March. After we testified, there was all sorts of moaning and complaining in media that the researchers and scholars, that word appeared over and over again, and referring to people who in no way are scholars, but that we had done them a terrible wrong through false statements and misrepresentations. And there were all sorts of denials, one of which came out via the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, which is one of the 4 private partners of the Election Integrity Partnership. Again, just to review, the Election Integrity Partnership was essentially like a cross-platform content moderation effort that targeted election-related speech. And there was a lot of stuff that was either de-amplified or removed, accounts that were deactivated as a result of recommendations by this EIP, which encompassed a whole bunch of platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and a number of others. Now, the big headline here is that, again, when Michael and I testified in March, we described the EIP as an effort in public-private censorship, among other things, because there was stuff like this already on the internet. This is from the head of Stanford's Internet Observatory, Alex Stamos, and he had this to say about why the EIP was formed.
There was a lack of capability around election disinformation. This is not because Sisa didn't care about disinformation, but at the time they lacked both kind of the funding and the legal authorizations to go do the kinds of work that would be necessary to truly understand how election disinformation was operating. So because of the feedback and the ideas from this group, we were able to pull together pretty quickly a project between these 4 different institutions to try to fill the gap of the things that the government could not do themselves.
All right. So even before you get to the surreptitious, damning, secret evidence that was, dug up by congressional investigators and stalwart investigative journalism, you already had the head of the EIP going on YouTube saying, yeah, we did this because it basically wouldn't have been legal for DHS to do it themselves. and they didn't necessarily have the money. So like, that's why. I mean, already right there, you have basically the story. But nonetheless, there was a tremendous amount of pushback to this assertion of that this was somehow some kind of censorship effort. And the University of Washington folks, they wrote unequivocally, CISA did not found, fund, or otherwise control the EIP. CISA, by the way, is a Department of Homeland Security sub-agency, the Cybersecurity and Internet Security Agency, as one source I talked to put it. It's cares so much about security, it put it in its name twice. CISA did not send content to the EIP to analyze, and the EIP did not flag content to social media platforms on behalf of CISA. If it matters, you can pay close attention to that language, because it's an example of something that these people do a lot, which is deny things that nobody alleges. But in any case, they did deny that CISA founded, funded, or controlled the EIP. These denials triggered this unbelievable almost year-long now pity party that's been thrown in the national media. And just as an example of some of the headlines, and by the way, thanks to everybody for being here. This is really cool to do this, and I'm really looking forward to this sort of interactive idea. So if anybody has any questions or anything like that throughout, please don't hesitate to ask them in the comment section, and I'll see if I can get to them. In any case, there was a raft of stories that came out. Here's one in the New York Times. Here's one in the Washington Post, which we'll get to later. That there's one of the researchers, Kate Starbird from UW, and this is a kind of a typical portrait. She's staring plaintively off into the distance. Oh, woe is me, the poor besieged anti-disinformation researcher, under attack by all these crazies. And they describe, one of the things they do is first of all, they described congressional subpoenas and freedom of information requests as, quote, tools of harassment. And there's a line in one of the Washington Post stories which describes a lawsuit by the Gateway Pundit, which they describe as, conspiracy-minded, and saying that they accuse them of, in a lawsuit, of being a government-private censorship consortium. And again, the contention is that this is a false, crazy, right-wing conspiracy theory. And we already knew from stuff like the Alex Stamos video and from other stuff in the Twitter files that the EIP was basically a Department of Homeland Security operation. But Jordan, through his subpoenas, got far more evidence of this. Here's an example. There's an email from somebody at the Atlantic Council who's talking to other folks at the Atlantic Council and saying, we just set up an election integrity partnership at the request of DHS/CISA. Jordan also found among the early work products of the EIP this diagram of how the workflow was going to work within this proposed new bureaucracy. You can see the central role of CISA, which is the government agency. There's this incredibly creepy Orwellian line in here. CISA provides warm introduction to election and special interest communities. And that line goes to Stanford, Graphica, Atlantic Council, and UW. And then there's this, sort of offhand illustration where the intelligence community, which has absolutely no legal business being involved in the domestic landscape, but they're just sort of a participant in this whole wonderfulness. So they dig up that, but we also, when they found all this stuff, um, it occurred to me that maybe we had been remiss in the Twitter files and not finding more evidence of this sort of thing, or looking for it the first time around. So I went back, and sure enough, there's lots of it. Here's an early email in early 2020 from one of Twitter's top lawyers saying DHS I'm assuming that's a mistake. DHS wants to establish a centralized portal for reporting disinformation. Later, there's another email saying Sisa received a grant to build a web portal for state and local election officials to report incidents of election-related misinformation. Why does that matter? Well, we'll come back to that. Here's an email in June. The committee report says that Twitter was briefed on this in May by DHS. And here's Twitter confirming we've already done a demo of this thing with DHS Sisa. Twitter has already received the demo on this product. That's them talking to somebody at Facebook. So why does this matter? Okay, well, one of the denials is Sisa didn't found, fund, or control the EIP. Well, here's founding. Here's funding. And here's controlling, essentially. I mean, they're the ones who are doing the demo. I mean, they perhaps didn't control the actual administration of the program, although we'll come to that. But they at least put it together at the beginning. And so this all directly refutes the denials at the time. Now, they found other stuff that was amazing. The EIP was brazen enough at the time, and you can see this in the story that I wrote on Racket, to put out a report for the public where they say that there's no government agency that has an explicit mandate to monitor and correct disinformation, because this, especially for disinformation that originates within the United States, which would likely be excluded from law enforcement action under the First Amendment, and not appropriate for study for intelligence agencies operating inside the United States. So as a result, state organizations that had a good relation with CISA over things like cybersecurity were sort of left on their lonesome when it came to misinformation. So they had to, so a coalition of like-minded partner institutions was created. This is them basically saying, we created this thing, or this thing was created because it would have been illegal for law enforcement and especially for intelligence agencies to do. So it was this was done instead. But that's what they said publicly. Jordan has now found things privately that are even worse. So remember how they described the idea that this was a First Amendment violation as conspiracy theory? I actually got this when I was interviewed by a number of people covering this story. I won't be petty enough to talk about which folks those are, but some of them gave me a hard time, for instance, about not being sure whether this was a First Amendment violation or not. My point at the time was, whatever it is, I hate it. If it's, if a judge rules it's illegal or it's technically, legal, either way, I don't want the Department of Homeland Security involved in regulating my speech. They seem to think that was vague or iffy, but whatever. But the committee found, they looked hard enough in the notes that Renee DiResta, who is the research director at Stanford, they found her notes to a presentation she gave on the EIP, saying that the gap the EIP was filling had, quote, several components, one of which was unclear legal authorities, including very real First Amendment concerns. So this is one of the founders of the program saying openly that, well, we're filling these gaps because of very real, there would be otherwise very real First Amendment concerns. And this is from people who have spent the entire year telling us that we were crazy for saying that there might be a First Amendment issue, and they themselves are conceding it in print. But of course, no one's ever going to go back and ask them about that now, except for people like us. So that happened. Now we come to this thing, and this is part of the reason why I wanted to do this explainer. I really want to commend the staffers at the House Weaponization of Government Committee. Anybody who's ever had any kind of contact with congressional investigators knows that it's these folks work a lot of hours. The members themselves mostly work 3 days a week, but the staffers are basically always working, and they have to do enormous quantities of research. And especially when you're looking at document production, and lawyers will know this too. If there are any lawyers out there listening, that your eyes glaze over when you look at boring document after boring document, and it takes a very, very sharp eye and a lot of stamina and a lot of attention to catch things that are important. And they caught this. This is an email that contains notes of a phone conversation between Facebook and an official at the Department of Homeland Security. And the phone call is about essentially the unusual bureaucratic structure of this program that they're going to create, and why does it need to be conducted through a superficially private organization called the Center for Internet Security, which, to get even more confusing, is almost 100% funded by Sisa. So CIS is basically funded by Sisa, but it's private. That's confusing enough. But why did they need to have CIS be the official mechanism for taking in complaints about misinformation from, for instance, state officials or local cops, or even just politicians or ordinary people? And here is the money paragraph. In the notes, they write, DHS cannot openly endorse the portal, but has behind the scenes signaled that NASS, NASED, and forgive me for having an acronym hangover, I don't remember what that stands for. They're I believe, state organizations, has told them that it would be easier for many states to have, quote, one reporting channel, and CISA and its ISAC, which is its Internet Security, Internet Security Analysis Center, would like to have incoming the same time that the platforms do. So this is just a complicated way of saying that DHS can't be the front of this organization, but beneath the surface, it still wants to be involved. Behind the scenes, it still wants to be involved. And not only that, CISA and ISAC, which is a sub-agency of CIS, to get even more confusing, CISA and CIS would like to have incoming the same time that the platforms do. If you're wondering what incoming is, all of the people in this world seem to have this irritating literary habit of turning verbs into nouns and nouns into verbs. Incoming is just like stuff they get in the mail or complaints or whatever. So they want to get the complaints at the same time that the platforms do. And this is important because it explains the rationale for this convoluted structure that we see here, and there's some other diagrams like it. But more to the point, it explains why they had to have a superficial private organization, CIS, which I infamously confused with Sisa in one of the Twitter files tweets and got nailed on it by Mehdi Hassan. But these groups are more or less interchangeable, but they needed to have CIS be in front because DHS cannot openly endorse the portal. Now, why was this important? When I saw this, my eyes lit up because it suddenly made sense of something that we didn't understand for a long time when we were looking at the Twitter files. Here, what you see is an example of an EIP case. You can see it says EIP 764, and it's got a number to it. This is actually, if I remember correctly, from the Georgia Secretary of State's office, and it's a report about a tweet that's inaccurately describing when the polls close. Whenever somebody sent in something like this to this email address, which, by the way, is essentially what CIS got paid for. They had an email address, and they forwarded the stuff that went there to other folks. Whenever a complaint came in, the complainer got this sort of form letter back, and the form letter said, what's next? We have already forwarded your report to our partners. Number one, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. They will submit it to the relevant social media platforms for review. Number two, the Election Integrity Partnership. Usually that said the Election Integrity Partnership of Stanford University. Here's an example of that here. I'm not sure why the other one is cropped like that, but when I saw this, and there were, I don't know, we must have seen this 100, 200 times, probably more than that. There are tons of these forms in the Twitter files, and we couldn't figure out what's going on here. Why did they create this crazy structure where people were, state officials were sending complaints to this weird mail drop run by this unknown Center for Internet Security, only to have it be forwarded instantaneously to CISA, which in turn forwards their stuff to the platforms for review. And then at the same time that CIS is taking this stuff and forwarding it to CISA, they're forwarding it to EIP, which then does its own judgment about this. This made zero sense to me. Like we could never figure out why they wanted to do it, and now we know because this email essentially explains that DHS wanted it that way. That they wanted to have they couldn't openly endorse the portal, so they had CIS be the face of it. But behind the scenes, they wanted to get the stuff at the same time as the platforms. And why is that important? Because it shows that CISA is not just a silent partner. It's not even just an organization that conceived of this stuff, maybe, or helped design it, but that they were intimately involved in the minute-to-minute administration of this program. And another great thing is that, in journalism or in any kind of investigation law, whatever, It's always great when one piece of evidence kind of fits like a jigsaw puzzle with another one, and this description of information coming to SIS and splitting immediately to two destinations fits exactly with what we saw in the Twitter files. And that's not right wing or left wing. That's just evidence, and that just shows how deeply they were involved in this whole program. Now, just quickly, a couple of other things. Sisa, one of the denials was Sisa did not send content to the EIP to analyze. And again, that might technically be true, but it didn't matter. They all got the content. Sisa actually sent its content to the platforms, and SIS sent the content to EIP, and it could easily have been the other way around. It just wasn't. That for them to deny that is just totally meaningless. The platform still got the stuff. Sisa was still in the middle of it, and they were still in the middle of it. It's just they're just playing games with semantics, which is one of the things that these people do very well. And last couple of notes are just about this content. These folks have been complaining all year that, everything we do is public. We do this public report. We're not hiding anything. We're not a secret cabal. We've been unfairly maligned by the Twitter Files reporters and by these evil Republicans and so on and so forth. Well, these people who were saying that everything they did was public and that they were an open book didn't turn over key information until they were threatened with contempt by Jordan. Here he is saying, if you don't turn the stuff over within 4 weeks, we're going to drop the hammer on you. So they finally send over the individualized nuts and bolts tickets, the complaints that EIP forwarded to the platforms. And here we see why they didn't want to turn this stuff over, because when you read it, the stuff reads like this: we recommend Twitter remove the tweet, as it is a fairly clear violation. We recommend to Twitter that the tweets be removed. We recommend removing the following tweets as misleading. They go on to say, we recommend not only removing this article, but every post that mentions this article. There's stuff like that all the way through. And this, whether it is exactly censorship or whether it just sounds like it, in conjunction with the now essentially demonstrated fact that this is really a DHS program, this kind of language is deeply disturbing. It's not even saying, well, here's our analysis of this. They're actually recommending action of a certain type. You can see there's some other stuff in Jordan's report, and I recommend that people check it out. That in other cases, the Sisa actually added their own 2 cents to these recommendations that EIP made. So they weren't just passing it along or what they called switchboarding. They were actually involved in the process of recommending things for removal or de-amplification or whatever. And a lot of this stuff was protected speech, like this Mike Huckabee tweet. Now, you don't have to be a fan of Mike Huckabee. I met him. I didn't love his politics. I thought he was a funny dude, but he tweeted this about how he stood in the rain for an hour to early vote. When he got home, I filled in my stack of mail-in ballots and then voted the ballots of my deceased parents and grandparents. They vote just like me. Har har, right? So he's making a funny, as it were, about the idea that mail-in ballots can be abused, and that's a constitutionally protected speech. But the judgment of the very serious EIP was that this needed to have a label on it. And again, apart from the fact that I don't want the Department of Homeland Security involved in this world at all, why do we need to have a public service announcement about this particular kind of speech? Last couple of things. These are exhibits that they are public, but they haven't been publicized from the Missouri v. Biden case. It's a discussion between an Atlantic Council guy, Graham Brookie, and Matt Masterson, who is a former Sisa official who, coincidence of coincidences, ended up at a cushy sinecure at Stanford University. And they're talking, this is in 2022, they're talking about what to do about CIS. And they're kind of suggesting that maybe we should cut them out of the deal. And Brookie is saying, my concern with an ISAC social media, that's ISAC is CIS, is that it may be less effective and drives up risk across the board, in particular for the USG. The primary concern is that it seems that CIS, which does some really great work, it's funny, they're clearly cognizant that this is foilable material, and they threw that in case someone from CIS ends up seeing it, which they now will. The concern is that CIS essentially described ESP and sees it as a growth area and consistent funding source. Here's the correspondence from Masterson. Thanks. I have been pounding on them for 2 months to do what they do best and not try to guerrilla their way into more. So you can see that in addition to this being a fairly transparent scheme for subverting the First Amendment by an intelligence service, it's also, a typical money-grubbing contracting situation where Masterson is saying that CIS should just be happy with getting $42 million to have an email address and not try to guerrilla their way into more. So the last thing I'll say, and I just want to test out this idea, see if this is possible. I wanted to take a quick look at one of the stories and just show how many different things about these stories are infuriating. This is one of the stories sort of suggesting that these people were that the researchers and scholars at the EIP have been unfairly put upon. First of all, look at this headline in the Washington Post. These academics studied falsehoods spread by Trump. Now the GOP wants answers. The implication being that academics were studying falsehoods that Trump said, and because of that, Jim Jordan is demanding emails and meetings and sending records requests. There's just no mention of the fact that these people are doing content removal and essentially censorship operations. It's just an unbelievably misleading headline, but that's just the beginning. Jordan's colleagues and staffers met Tuesday on Capitol Hill with a frequent target of right-wing activists. Again, they always do this. They never mention other people who have a problem with these folks. It's always right-wing activists. 2 weeks after they interviewed Clemson University professors who also track online propaganda, according to people familiar with the events. That's about it, by the way, that's about as weak for inside baseball journalism stuff. That's about as weak an attribution as you can get. According to people familiar, that's like according to someone. I've seen a lot of stuff. There's according to people familiar with the matter, but that lowers the bar even more. So let's go on with a couple of other things. The push caps years of pressure for conservative activists who have harangued such academics online and in person and filed open records requests to obtain the correspondence of those working at public universities. The researchers who have been targeted study the online spread of disinformation. including falsehoods that have been accelerated by former President and candidate Donald Trump and other Republican politicians. There's so many things wrong with this, the way they write this. Again, no suggestion that there's that any of these people were doing work that actually resulted in people being taken off the internet or that their content was taken off. Instead, they were just studying things false things that were said by Donald Trump and other Republican politicians. No mention of other folks who might have gotten things wrong or who whose content might fall under the rubric of misinformation. Jordan has argued that content removals urged by some in the government have suppressed legitimate theories on vaccine risks and the COVID-19 origins, as well as news stories wrongly suspected of being part of foreign disinformation campaigns. And then here's the part about, where the Gateway Pundit, the conspiracy theory prone outlet, alleging that they are part of a government-private censorship consortium that tramples on free speech. The campaign has kept alive the narrative that government officials violate the First Amendment's free speech guarantee by working with a variety of professors, Twitter, and Facebook. It's just totally avoiding what this actually is. Working with a variety of professors, Twitter and Facebook. They didn't, first of all, no mention of working with a variety of vets from the NSA, CIA, and National Security Council. They make it seem like it's just people doing research. And then they complain about artificial intelligence. Here's Starboard complaining about how intimidating it is to have people with a lot of power making false claims. This is a person who sits on an advisory committee for the Department of Homeland Security, complaining about other people with power. Then here she is talking about the hardship of getting a letter demanding years of communications. And no mention of the fact that people are entitled to those communications. If you receive money from the government, if you're working on a publicly funded project, you don't get to hold this stuff back. The public is entitled to see this stuff. They're entitled to know the nuts and bolts of how these things work. You don't get to just write your own version of what you do and leave it at that. We get to see how it works. And then they do the pro forma thing of actually quoting Russell Dye, who's a Jordan staffer. Then they talk about academic institutions and why they kickstarted the disinformation research field 6 years ago, after revelations that Russian operatives were covertly using social media to influence the 2016 presidential election. Again, no mention of the fact that any of those stories turned out to be bullshit, or that the Washington Post had to retract a whole bunch of them, including ones about that very topic. None of that here. But then they go on. But the study of online disinformation turned into a political lightning rod, with partisan groups sparring over who determines what is true and what the consequences should be, if any, for those who persistently spread lies. And again, this is them shifting the discussion from what should we do about an intelligence service that gets involved in sort of mass violations of the First Amendment, and what should we do about that? No, they say, the debate is really what should we do about people who persistently spread lies online. And many of the academics have worked on the most fraught topics, and then there's just more complaints. And let's see, what there's one more thing I wanted to mention involved with this. This is great. Starbird has long been a target of online harassment, but the campaigns have grown brutal after she provided a statement to the congressional committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Internet foes besieged her government employer with demands for her private emails and told her that they knew where she lived. And then here she is in her requisite smart glasses, looking sadly off into the distance. Again, I didn't even know that she had done a statement about January 6th. I'm not a Republican. I'm interested in her emails because she's working on an incredibly dangerous program that the public has a right to know about, not because of any of that. Couple of last things. Here's a quote. The set of techniques used to harass people online has gotten more sophisticated, said Alice Marwick, an associate professor of communications at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Right now, there's a lot of bad actors who are using FOIA requests to harass academics working at public universities. And that wasn't something we saw until a few years ago. Well, Alice Marwick also appears quoted in the New York Times story about the same subject. And another inside baseball journalism thing, you will often see when a story is actually being pushed on reporters by the subjects of the reporting, people like, well, let's just say people who are involved in EIP, they will try to avoid being quoted themselves very often, but there will be some other person who will say all the things that they want to say, but don't want to have attributed to them. And so that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at related news stories. See if the same person is quoted over and over again, and see if if other people aren't quoted over and over again. Again, right-leaning critics, blah, blah, blah. And just no mention of any of the important stuff. So anyway, I just wanted to experiment with this format. And I'm thinking about looking at occasionally at news stories and kind of showing people some of the stuff that if you worked in journalism for a long time, you'll spot between the lines. Why is this person not quoted? Why is this paragraph higher or lower? If people think that's something that might be interesting going forward, I'll try that again. But mostly I just wanted to go through this story, which is going to be ignored for all the reasons that you can expect, but is actually a very important story. And if anybody had any doubts what the EIP is, all you need to do is look at the documents. You don't have to listen to Jim Jordan talk. You don't have to listen to me talk. All you have to do is look at the emails. They say all the stuff and compare them to what the denials are. And it should be abundantly clear that this is a government effort to get involved with something that's rather serious. What kinds of speech heading into an election are seen more, seen less, are labeled, not labeled. They act like this is just a pro forma effort to get rid of, what do they say? Persistent lies. But these have programs like this have profound impact on how people vote, which people will turn up. One of the ads that they wanted to label was a pro-Trump ad calling for Trump to make Election Day a national holiday so that people could go out and vote in person. It also says that, makes a crack about Nancy Pelosi wanting to cancel your vote. But that's not disinformation. That's protected speech. You're allowed to say that. And they're making up these rules that we've never had on the fly. And even more offensively, they're not going to go back and correct any of the record on any of this stuff. You know, again, after spending all year saying it was conspiracy theory that people were worried about the First Amendment, will one reporter go back and say, gosh, you know, Renee DiResta said that herself. She wrote it in her notes. Maybe we should ask Renee about that. Or is there going to be a single reporter who'll go back and say, you know, we describe these people as scholars and as researchers. What's the academic specialty of somebody like Renee DiResta, who doesn't have one? I mean, she's a research director at the Stanford Internet Observatory, but she's not a scholar in the traditional sense. So they'll just leave stuff like this hanging. And in a related story, you know, there's this sort of cartel-like situation now where if it's not mentioned in a quote-unquote authoritative sources like the Post, the Times, and you know, the Daily Beast or MSNBC or whatever, it's not in Google News, it's not referenced in Wikipedia, and the story might as well not exist. So even though this thing has been essentially proved, it's very possible that there just won't be any follow-up to it because the current system allows stories like this to be in plain view and buried at the same time, which I think is crazy. You know, I hope they eventually realize it's crazy too. So that's basically it. Let me take a quick look through the comments and see if there are any questions. Where is the best place to view the entirety of the House Judiciary docs? They are, I mean, I linked to them in my story on Racket, but if you go to if you just type in House Weaponization of Government Committee and look for, there's a little rubric for documents, that'll be on there. It has attachments. Let's see what else, any other questions? No, I think that's pretty much it. So, all right. This was fun. I enjoyed that. Did everybody else enjoy this? If so, let's do more of these, and you know, we'll find ways to talk about the stuff that's in the news, not necessarily stuff that I wrote about, but some other things. And oh, here's a good question. Here's a great question. Before I go, what qualifies? This is from Brandy M. What qualifies anyone to decide what is truth or fiction? It's a great question, right? Why has nobody asked that question? Why is how is there a story in the New Yorker and the New York Times and the Washington Post and PBS Frontline, and not one of them says, hey, isn't it weird that you guys regulate speech about the coronavirus and there's no doctors involved in your operation? I mean, how are you deciding that people like Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford or Martin Kulldorff at Harvard, or even just somebody who had a relative who died of myocarditis, how are you qualified to say that that's misinformation? What's your qualification? This is it's an insidious part of this whole thing, but this whole idea that anti-disinformation is itself a kind of expertise is a total fallacy. And experts are not only wrong accidentally quite often, they're often wrong on purpose, as we see in episodes like the WMD and to a lesser extent COVID, maybe even to a greater extent, I don't know. But that's why we have unfettered free speech, because you need to pierce that cartel-like situation, and there's no way to do it. But what they're really up to here by creating this class of disinformation experts and researchers is just creating a wall between who gets to be a censor and who doesn't. You know, the one stakeholder, EIP sort of helpfully made a graph of who gets to be involved in this, and they listed 4 major stakeholders. There were the platforms, civil society organizations, the government, and the news media. And who's missing from that? Ordinary people. This is the essence of this whole thing. Not only is it a DHS intelligence, service getting involved in news, but they're creating a system whereby it's always people from this rarefied community who are censoring everybody else. And it's like the old saying by Ira Glasser, who was the ACLU guy back when the ACLU was real. He said the key question with censoring is who's doing it. And in 99% of the cases, it ain't you. It's these people, and these people are terrible. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, and let's do this more often. And have a good weekend. Talk to you soon.